And if there are no questions, we can start right away. Like whatever.
Okay, ma'am. So if anyone has any questions, you can either raise the hand or type in chat box or question and answer section anyway.
And if no questions, I can commence right away. I don't see anything. So I'm going to commence. Could you please tell us what is the meaning of CA, CP, IB in the diary numbers of NCLT matters? How sweet. All right. CA is company application. So when you say, when there's a company number, when CP and IB form part of a company petition number. For example, I have lodged, one of the matters I did was CP IB 25 ND 2018, which means CP is company petition, IB is insolvency and bankruptcy. 25 of 2018 will be the number of the 20, and my petition is the 25th petition in 2018, and ND, KB, MH depends on where you're filing. ND is New Delhi, KB is Kolkata bench, MH is Maharashtra, so NCLT Mumbai. So I'll type it here to give you an idea. So it will be CP, IB, /25, say ND, or like KB / 2018. So CP is the company petition, IB refers to insolvency and bankruptcy, number of the petition, that your bench geographical designation. I'll tell you why this is important. IB, because NCLT has 3 types of jurisdiction: company, competition, and insolvency. So IB versus any other kind of petition has a different kind of numbering. Insolvency petitions are given IB or IBA in some cases like Chennai. Any other question? This is a useful question. Where else do I type this? Let me type it in Q&A.
And you can change the settings of from all panelists to all attendees.
All panelists, right? This was the company petition I was referring to. Sure. Okay. See. Okay. Somebody's given me a diary number of sorts. CA number 1340 PB 2019 in 1396. Are you sure that's right? So broadly, I'll tell you what this means. CA number 1340 PB 2019 refers to the company application. Company applications generally interim applications filed in the company petition. So, example, an insolvency case is going on, and I file an application in the middle for XYZ relief. I hope you know what an interim application means. It means an application filed anytime during the duration of a case to seek interim orders. That is orders which are not final orders. So CA 1340 PB 2019 would mean, PB is principal bench, by the way. Principal bench is at New Delhi. CA number 1340 means it is an interim application filed before the principal bench in 2019, and in the scheme of all the interim applications filed in 2019, it is 1340th application. In IB 967 PB 2018 refers to the main insolvency petition number. That is the main case number with which this interim application is filed. So that IB refers to insolvency and bankruptcy. 967 PB 2018 means this is the 967th insolvency petition in the 2018. I hope that clears it for you, Aryan. Understood. The difference between CA and CP is that CA is interim in nature. Yes, CA refers to company application. CP is the company petition, which is the main insolvency petition. Yes. Right. All right. Awesome. I'm going to just go back to where we were yesterday. We were at interim orders, and since I was trailing off towards the end, I just thought I'll revisit this 5 minutes and then move on. Interim orders, as I said, have been a rarity in the scheme of insolvency jurisdiction. primarily because the whole purpose of insolvency is not recovery but resolution, and that generally interim orders were given very sparingly and not even thought to be given until this 2018 decision. This 2018 decision comes after a lot of clarity that Rule 11 of NCLT rules applies to IBC. If those who don't understand, NCLT rules were promulgated after the NCLT came into force. NCLT was brought into action pursuant to section of the Companies Act. Now it was understood that NCLT would replace the Company Law Board and become the relevant company tribunal. However, when insolvency and bankruptcy court was rolled out, NCLT was vested with the insolvency jurisdiction as well. NCLT obviously has its own act. NCLT has its own set of rules, and which determine its functioning. But the question that arises now and again, that arose now and again, was whether the NCLT rules that govern NCLT, do they apply to IBC? Because NCLT was initially set up as a replacement for CLB, which is the Company Law Board, which would have company jurisdiction, which is a completely different set of matters, as opposed to insolvency, which is a summary jurisdiction and a different type of matters. Rule 11, which is inherent powers of the tribunal to pass any order to meet the ends of justice or prevent the abuse of power, applies. Right, and these interim orders which were passed in this NCLAT decision was coming from that power. Now, as I was talking about this yesterday, not quite sure what is the extent of these interim powers, because it's broadly worded and no particular decision has narrowed down the purview of this power. For example, ends of justice and abuse of power could mean anything. In my opinion, I do think this power should be exercised keeping in mind the larger purpose of the court, which is running the corporate debtor as a going concern. Second, preserving the assets of a corporate debtor. To this end, I also try to distinguish between two such situations yesterday. One situation was where the corporate debtor was trying to alienate its property and was taking adjournment after adjournment so it could sell off some of its property before an insolvency order could be passed against it. That to me seems like trying to evade the powers of the court, and the purpose of which is to ensure all the assets of a company are in one place for ultimate effective dissolution of its asset to its creditors under the resolution plan or the liquidation plan. So doing something like that seems to suggest that you are going to evade the purpose of the court, and an interim order therefore becomes required to protect the corporate debtors' interests and interests of all other creditors. I try to distinguish this situation from the situation where, say, a company is asked to keep a certain amount of money aside, which a creditor believes is owed to it. What I'm trying to say is, for example, if I as a creditor file an insolvency petition against a company, and I say that why don't you ask the corporate debtor to keep this money aside till you decide the case, because insolvency proceedings will go on for a fairly long time. So the problem here is, I don't see why a corporate debt. Firstly, there is no unless I state there's a reasonable apprehension that I believe that a certain chunk of money will be sent away. There is no way that certain interim order should be granted to me. Also, and if my reasonable apprehension is just that because I have filed an insolvency petition against somebody who I know is defaulting, that's not sufficient to prove reasonable apprehension. In cases of property, you can perhaps prove that I have this reasonable apprehension that the other person is going to sell away the property, and you can use, say, minutes of a meeting or a particular sale deed or an agreement to sell that the corporate debtor may have signed. In such a scenario where you have no basis to prove reasonable apprehension, and frankly are just trying to secure a remedy for yourself by ensuring that some money that is supposed to be paid to you is kept aside, that I don't think in such situations interim orders should be granted. Because by doing this, you are not only preventing the corporate debtor from running as a going concern, you're also preventing the chunk of money being available to other creditors of the corporate debtor who are equally important in the scheme of things. As I said, insolvency is a proceeding in rem, or anything that happens in these insolvency proceedings is equally applicable to any other creditor and not just the creditor who has filed the application. Right. And I've told you that I've tried to review the other NCLT cases that followed this NCLAT decision, which mentions interim orders, and they've also decided on property lines. I am yet to come across a case where it's not about property and it's about any other sort of relief. Right. Somebody's asked me, in the previous insolvency laws, CPC procedure was followed. Are we still following the same or a new procedure laid down in IBC, especially regarding admission of evidence? Hi, Yasasi, just to answer your question, CPC principles follow. IBC proceedings are not bound by the CPC. Secondly, in regard to taking of evidence, NCLTs have summary jurisdiction. So, in fact, they've categorically said that they deal with proceedings that don't require taking of evidence. If taking of evidence is required, then you're asked to go and appeal for a civil court. That's in fact the distinction between NCLT and any other court. At NCLTs refuse to go into complicated questions of fact requiring evidence, and for everything else, CPC principles apply, and they can travel beyond CPC as well. An example of them being able to travel beyond CPC was, for a while, until the amendment came to the IBC, limitation was not applicable to IBC, and then another question was open. Only when a particular amendment came and Supreme Court decisively said limitation applies, was then limitation deemed to limitation became applicable to proceedings. That is, the 3 year any claim after 3 years was not admitted by an NCLT. Right. Another question is, can OC file for an interim order for an injunction on dispute proceedings if his initial plea for CIRP is rejected because of errors in notice under Form 3? Okay, this has a couple of layers. So what happened? Errors, okay, beginning from the beginning. Errors in notice and demand notice in Form 3 is generally not met with your petition being thrown out. You're generally asked to issue a new demand notice. So in such a case, OC will have to issue a new demand notice. I don't think you will not be allowed to seek interim orders until you file a fresh demand notice that meets the particulars of the court. So it's not that your plea for CIRP will be rejected. A petition will go on and you'll be asked to furnish the particulars that you didn't file initially. Can OC file for an interim order for an injunction on dispute proceedings? Can you ask this question slightly better, because I'm not understanding. If by dispute proceedings, do you mean proceedings going on in a civil court where the actual dispute is there, or you mean in the NCLT where dispute is being discussed while he's filed this petition and he's seeking to file an interim order, seeking an interim order in the meanwhile? Could you answer live if possible? Could you ask live? Anybody? Whoever this is? Okay, somebody will have to ask this question because I didn't understand the second part of the question. What exactly do you mean by an OC file for an interim order for an injunction on dispute proceedings? What I've told you is that Form 3 demand notice, if not, it doesn't meet the criteria, will be chucked out. You can seek interim orders if you can prove a reasonable apprehension. All right, somebody is talking. Hi, Ajitesh. All right. Would you want to talk? All right, awesome. Yeah. You're on mute. Ajitesh, you're on mute. I can't hear you.
Am I audible?
Yeah, now you're audible. Yeah.
Yes. So I was asking that if a petition is thrown out on some technical grounds, then can he claim for an injunction on a future proceedings if the corporate debtor tries to file a dispute in the meantime in some court on the payment?
So, okay. I sort of get what you mean. I think you mean that I file a demand notice doesn't meet the criteria. As I've told you, your petition doesn't get thrown out if you doesn't meet the criteria. You're asked to furnish the particulars that you missed out within 7 days. So generally, most people who are smart will do that. If your petition gets thrown out after that, because you didn't furnish the particulars in 7 days, that's a different story. Suppose now you are saying in the meanwhile, this petition gets thrown out and he's trying to institute fresh proceedings, and in the meantime, somebody the corporate debtor files for dispute. I've seen an NCLAT case where 2 demand notices existed and the previous demand notice was taken into consideration. In any case, you can place these facts before the tribunal and say this dispute is a post facto response to the filing issue, And I'm certain the tribunal will take into note the fact that there existed no dispute prior to the initial demand notice. I don't think that will be a problem. It shouldn't, the fault in the filing should not prejudice the particular operational creditor and allow the corporate debtor room to create dispute when none existed before the initial demand notice. I hope that answers your question. All right. Moving on. Now, I think I've said enough, and I'm certain you know that the most important part of these insolvency proceeding is the moratorium that gets imposed right after CIRP initiation. Moratorium is again institution of suits or continuation of pending suits or proceedings, including execution of a judgment against a corporate debtor, which are pending, or so basically you can't continue pending stuff. You can't initiate anything in new proceedings. You can't transfer any of his property, create a right in his property, or take any action, SARFAESI action against the property, or try and recover any property which is occupied by the corporate debtor or in possession of the corporate debtor. If you see this is a reproduction of section 14 from the IBC code, and if you look at subsection D, recovery of any property by an owner or lessor where such property is occupied by or in the possession of the corporate debtor. The impact of this particular subclause is that, suppose if I'm a corporate debtor and I go into CII process, I perhaps work out of a lease premises. I know of a corporate debtor that's, by the way, sits in Nehru Place, prime property, and they haven't been able to pay rent, and the lessor can't enforce the rights against the corporate debtor, because the whole purpose is to ensure the corporate debtor gets that one place where he can sort out its affairs for the duration of the moratorium and can figure itself out for it to come out and start dealing with recovery proceedings after the resolution plan. So the purpose of B is to ensure that even rental obligations are not enforced against the corporate debtor. What moratorium? So these exclusions, by exclusions I mean that by moratorium doesn't mean all of its services or the contracts that it was supposed to continue will stop. Essential services such as supply, electricity, and power are supposed to continue. This is now part of the code, but when I joined the insolvency team initially and I was working on the code, this amendment did not exist. So I remember I was doing this case called Innovative Industries versus MSEB, where Innovative Industries being in Maharashtra and the RP had taken over, and MSEB, which is Maharashtra State Electricity Board, had cut off all electricity, saying that until it pays my dues, I'm not going to supply any electricity. So the entire plant shut. You have to understand, for industries, if their machines don't work, they really can't generate enough revenue or carry on functioning as a corporate debt or as like on a going concern basis. So Innovative went to NCLAT, and NCLAT realized this problem and said that told the RP to make whatever payments to MSEB and asked MSEB to start supplying electricity. After that, an amendment was made into the code and in the CIRP regulations, saying that the RP should keep making critical payments to these electricity and power suppliers, and they will continue to provide essential services. They should not be stopped because of the moratorium. Critical contracts have to continue. Aside from critical contracts, for example, say for any corporate debtor, for example, somebody in the cement industry would be contracts with somebody who supplies the raw material, somebody who supplies the machinery. These critical contracts should continue, and as long as payments are being made. The whole point to ensure that critical contracts continue and payment is made is to ensure the supply chain continues, and these creditors sort of get priority while the CII process is going on, to ensure that these critical creditors get paid off, so that the corporate debtor's insolvency doesn't affect or cause insolvency of any other goods or service provider. I don't know if you guys know this. A large part of the creditors of Essar Steel have gone into insolvency because Essar Steel went into insolvency, or so say the statistics. And that happens because if you put a corporate debtor under insolvency and is unable to make payments, or because it has very few reserves, the creditors who depend on Essar Steel also suffer. Right. Licenses and permits continue. Initially, there was this broad question as to what happens to the licenses and permits given by a company once it goes into corporate insolvency. The question was understandable, keeping in mind the fact that once it goes into insolvency, it perhaps would perhaps be so this concept of undischarged insolvents, which carries on from the previous Insolvency Acts, perhaps it was seen as perhaps what if this particular new corporate debtor carries on that disqualification, and maybe its existing licenses and permits get revoked. The answer to that is no, they don't, and a particular amendment has been made into the court incorporating that, simply because sometimes these licenses and permits are extremely important for it to continue its business. For example, say a corporate debtor which does alcohol delivery and supply. If it doesn't have its requisite permits, it will not be able to carry out its business. Even when the RP takes over, those permits need to continue for the RP to ensure that the corporate debtor goes on as a going concern. All right. Another amendment that was made was surety in a contract of corporate guarantee, which means anybody who's given a corporate guarantee towards the corporate debtor, they will the moratorium doesn't bind them, and they can go and proceed against anybody else, and you can proceed against any other surety of a corporate debtor during the insolvency process. Sorry, I'll correct myself. The question is, there's a corporate debtor and it has a guarantor who is given a corporate guarantee. Generally, it's any other company which is an associate company of the corporate debtor who is given a guarantee to secure the loan obligations of the corporate debtor. The question then arises is, during the moratorium, when the corporate debtor is insulated from all litigation, can you proceed against the surety? Initial answer of the Allahabad High Court was no. So there was this case for LML Lohia, where the Allahabad High Court said and accepted the arguments of the petitioners who were trying to defend against them. They were guarantors of a corporate debtor which was under insolvency, and they said recovery proceedings against us under DRT should not be allowed, because when the corporate debtor is under moratorium, its debts haven't crystallized, and a guarantor's obligation and liability is commensurate to that of the corporate debtor. And if the debt amount against a corporate debtor hasn't crystallized, how should a guarantor be allowed to proceed against? Then it went up to the Supreme Court, and by that time, this amendment, the surety in a contract of corporate guarantee can be proceeded against in terms of the moratorium. That amendment had also come into force. So the question was, one, would this amendment apply to cases prior to that, or was this a new amendment which would only apply post facto? Secondly, the ultimate question was, can you at all proceed against a surety or a guarantor of a corporate debtor when the corporate debtor is in moratorium? Justice Nariman heard this case. He decided to the first question, that is an amendment made, whether it's applicable to prior amendments or not. He said something very poignant. He said any such clarifications which intended to enforce the object and purpose of the court, which is moratorium for the creditor, but all other recovery for all creditors, they should be seen as clarificatory in nature. Now, clarificatory amendments means that they are retrospectively applicable. So I got the benefit of this case, and I was doing a matter right before this judgment came out, and till then the question, I was doing some matter in DRT, and I was appearing against a guarantor of a very famous corporate debtor, and the corporate debtor, since it was in CI process, the guarantor was saying that she should not be allowed to proceed against me because CI process is going on. When this amendment came prior to this judgment, I also made a similar argument saying that this is a clarificatory judgment, and there are a lot of Supreme Court cases that talk about clarificatory amendments being retrospective in nature. But it was in DRT. The DRT PO said, let me await the judgment. Then, thankfully, Justice Nariman came out with this judgment which clarified a lot. It also said both guarantors and corporate debtors have liabilities which are joint and several. So while they are joint, they also have several liabilities to the creditor. And if one can't fulfill that liability, the guarantor should be made liable to fulfill that liability. That's the point of taking a guarantee. That is, if a corporate debtor is unable to pay you, the principal debtor is unable to pay you, you should be able to go back to the corporate guarantor and say, dude, pay me my money back. So these are the 2 points that SBI versus V. Ramakrishnan held, and that's become an important judgment in terms of what is clarificatory amendment and proceeding against the surety of a corporate debtor. All right. Somebody asked me in the first session and as to what is the time limit for filing claim for the IRP. As I said, the time limit initially gets specified in the public announcement that's made by the IRP. As I said, IRP gets appointed on the first date of the initiation of CIRP, and within 3 days he is to make a public announcement. public announcements generally specifies the date by which you're supposed to submit your claims to the RP, who will verify these claims and get back to you as to how much of it is admitted. I may also require you to note that RPs are not quasi-judicial or judicial authorities. They don't have the final say on what whether a claim is time barred or whether a claim should be admitted or not. His role is limited to verification and collation of claims. Sometimes in practice, I do feel the difference gets blurred because ultimately verification and collation of claims will mean that he has to authenticate a part of the claims and leave out some of the bits. I do think in practice the difference gets blurred, but Swiss Ribbons, Supreme Court has said that there's a stark distinction between the RP and the liquidator who gets appointed during liquidation. Liquidator has quasi-judicial powers to admit, reject a claim, and authoritatively recognize the merits of a claim. RP just verifies and collates the claim. In any case, initially the law was that RP can accept claims until whatever time possible, right? Then came an amendment. Then came an amendment that all right, not all time possible, but until the 90th day of the CIRP, which is what I've shown right now. So under Regulation 12, subclause 2, a creditor who fails to submit proof of claim within the time stipulated in the public announcement may submit the claim with proof to the IRP or the RP, as the case may be, on or before the 90th day of the insolvency commencement date. Now, this is beneficial for the RP in running the process smoothly, but is not beneficial to the other creditors. You have to understand, so it's a big company, you will find out sooner or later that it went into insolvency. For a relatively smaller company, and public announcement gets made in national and local dailies, it's not easy to find out if a corporate debtor was in insolvency. Or like a person who you owed you money went into insolvency. Then what do you do? And also, I've seen largely with my clients, it takes a while to arrange their documentation and get it to place. By the time they gather their bearings, for sure the 90-day period has passed. So in such a scenario, NCLT, sorry, I've received a question. Somebody's asking, will the moratorium apply on the corporate guarantor if the creditor proceed against the corporate guarantor and corporate debtor simultaneously? All right. So the question is, moratorium, okay, at the outset, moratorium does not apply on the corporate guarantor at all. If the corporate guarantor is not in CI process, it will not apply. So that's part one of your question. If the creditor proceeds against the corporate debtor and the corporate guarantor simultaneously, you mean simultaneously, say one in NCLT and one in CI process? You can do that. You can proceed against the company in CI process, and you can proceed against the company in the guarantor in the DRT or any other recovery forum, if that's what you're asking. The answer to that is yes, I've done that. It gets complicated though, because if you recover the debts from a guarantor, then if you are able to recover the debts from the guarantor, your claim will not be considered before the IRP of the corporate debtor. So you may be sure of that. But then the CI process will still continue, and other creditors will be able to file their claims. I hope that's what you were asking, Yashasvi. Can you file against the corporate debtor and a corporate guarantor before the NCLT together? No. The answer to that is no. Okay. Coming back. So now NCLT, in order to remove the woes of all the creditors, has said in Edelweiss Asset versus Adel and Landmarks that the rejection of a claim on ground of delay is not a tenable defense at all. And we make it very clear that the RPs should take a note of these repeated decisions being given by NCLT to show that the claim, if submitted by a creditor, even and beyond the stipulated time of 90 days, should not be rejected on the ground of belated submission at all. Now there's another decision called Globe Express Services that went a bit further. In this case, a resolution professional had not admitted the claim of the RP of a creditor, and the company went into liquidation. And then the person came back saying, it's gone into liquidation, my claim has not been admitted, at least admit it now. And the liquidator was like, no, since the RP didn't accept your claim during the 90-day period, now it's too late. And the tribunal said that it's okay if it's too late. There's nothing that's too late, because claims of the creditors should continue to be serviced as long as the assets of a corporate debtor have not been dissolved. They relied on a couple of US decisions and UK decisions they have in the previous past to come to this conclusion that claims should be serviced at all times until there's nothing left in terms of the assets of the corporate debtor to service that claim. Somebody's asked the question. Can a creditor get kicked off the COC if DRT gives a creditor relief from the corporate guarantor? Possibly. Possibly. I don't see why it shouldn't. If somebody's recovered the same debt from a corporate guarantor, I don't think he deserves to get paid twice. So somebody's relief, I've seen once actually a case where they did get paid. So there was a debt component and an interest component, and the debt component got paid off by the guarantor. So the particular bank's claim before the COC got majorly reduced only to the interest component. I hope that answers the question, Aditya. Right. Moving on. Now, as I said, a large part of focus has gone on to who is the eligible person to submit a resolution plan. This becomes important because to meet the objective of the code, which is that the company shouldn't fall back in the hands of somebody who's run the company down. So 29A was introduced with that intention, which was discussed yesterday. I'm going to discuss 29A and the judgment of Essar Steel right now. All right. Right. Any other question? All right. So who is not eligible to be a resolution applicant in terms of 29A? An undischarged insolvent, willful defaulter. Willful defaulter, in layman terms, somebody who keeps on being irregular in his debt service obligations in terms of the RBI guidelines. I will not go into what the RBI guidelines are, the Banking Regulation Act, and there's a circular on willful defaulters that should help you. This is very important. C is at the time of submission of the resolution plan has an account or an account of the corporate under management or control of such person or whom such person is a promoter, classified as a non-performing asset in accordance with the guidelines of the BRA, or has been, or at least, or a time period of 1 year has passed since the person has been promoted, has been classified as an NPA, and they have not removed such disqualification. Simply speaking, if I or somebody who's related to in terms of an entity to me has an NPA, and that NPA has been existing for 1 year, and I've not done anything to clear the account or standardize the account, then I am disqualified under this act to submit a resolution plan in terms of the code. Simply because if I am unable to service the debts of my own of the entities that I am related to, and if I can't manage, say, one entity, I don't think I should be given the reins of any other entity. Next question is, this proviso that provided the person shall be eligible to submit a resolution plan if such person makes payment of all overdue amounts with interest thereon and charges relating to NPA before submission of resolution plan. This came in the context of Essar Steel. I'll tell you why. Because in that case, there were two parties that were ineligible to submit a resolution plan. So after seeing the situation, an amendment was seen in the code that, okay, it's okay if you have an NPA, as long as you can clear those accounts, you should not be held to be disqualified to submit a plan under the code. Then these are explanations. For the purpose of proviso, related party does not include financial entities of financial sector regulator, any entity controlled by a financial sector regulator. And so also it does, so suppose a resolution applicant has an account on account of a corporate debtor. So suppose a resolution applicant has acquired a corporate debtor which was in CIR process. And now because of that, it has acquired stake in an NPA which went into CIR process. That particular resolution applicant is also allowed to bid for any other company, and that the fact that it has acquired a company which is previously in NPA but through CIR process, that won't be applicable to this company for 3 years from the date of acquisition of such other company which was a corporate debtor under the CIR process. All right. D is if if the resolution applicant has been convicted for any offence punishable with imprisonment for 2 or more years under any act specified under the 12th schedule, or for 7 or more under any law forbidding time being in force. Provided this clause shall not apply to a person after the expiry of a period of 2 years from the date of release of his imprisonment. So if 2 years of conviction, 2 years after that you want to apply, you can, to be a resolution applicant. I'm not going to go into the intricacies of this. One part which was important is, I think G got missed out. So subsection G of 29A is when a corporate debtor has given a guarantee in respect of a bank, of the bank that initiated CIR process, and that corporate guarantee remains unpaid. I'll give you an example. For example, I initiated CIR process against X. X has a director who's given a corporate guarantee. X has director Y who was given a corporate guarantee in respect of X. Now Y wants to bid. Y wants to bid in the CIR process of, say, X, even if it's not in control of a company which was NPA. The fact that remains is that he's given an unenforceable guarantee. He's given an enforceable guarantee, and that remains unpaid. And that corporate guarantor may have given a guarantee to the bank that has initiated the CIR process, or any other bank. Though the words of subsection G are very clear, they only refer to the bank that's initiated the CIR process and not any other bank. I'll give you a more particular example of this as we go on. But for now, I'll try to explain Essar Steel. Essar Steel was the corporate debtor that went into insolvency in August of 2017. Eventually, after much litigation, it got 2 bidders, ArcelorMittal India Private Limited and New Metal. ArcelorMittal backed by Lakshmi Mittal, and ArcelorMittal is a subsidiary of ArcelorMittal Netherlands. Now, New Metal is backed by 4 companies and also has 2 subsidiaries, one of which is backed by Revant Ruia, who's also the promoter of Essar Steel. NCLT found both ArcelorMittal and New Metal, the bidders for Essar Steel, ineligible in terms of section 29A of the code. The ineligibility of ArcelorMittal was in respect of the accounts it held. ArcelorMittal had accounts in 2 companies, KSS Petron and Uttam Galva Metallics. These companies had become non-performing assets in terms of RBI. And since ArcelorMittal through its related parties had control over these non-performing assets, it could not, in terms of section 29AC, make an application to be a resolution applicant under the code. And even at the date of application as a resolution applicant, it had not removed those NPAs. So as on that date, it stood disqualified. Then New Metal's problem, as I said, the promoter or related party was Revant Ruia, who was related to a corporate debtor, which is anyway an NPA, which is Essar Steel. So New Metal got disqualified because of corporate debtor relations with an NPA, and which is the corporate debtor relation, the promoter relations with the corporate debtor, and Arcelor itself was related to accounts having NPA, so that's why Arcelor got disqualified. Finally, they went to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court examined the corporate structures of these applicants. That is Arcelor having been backed by Lakshmi Mittal, who has controlling stake in both KSS Petron, Uttam Galva, New Metal being backed by AEL and Crimean Bay, and AEL having been backed by Revant Ruia, who anyway holds a stake in the corporate debtor, which is Essar Steel. And it said that, look, it said a couple of important things. 29A has to be given a purposive interpretation. Means you have to look, you can't go into the corporate notions of what's control, positive control, negative control, whether that gives control or not. You have to look at the purpose behind 29A and who it sought to ban. If directly or indirectly those he sought to ban, those the code sought to ban are able to bid for the company, then those should not be allowed to bid. That's the underlying principle. There was also a lot of talk about positive and negative control, because the shareholding rights of Revant Ruia was such that they gave negative control. I'm certain you guys have now done M&A courses enough to know that what is positive control, negative control. For example, veto rights are negative control. Positive control means you have actual voting rights. The example of positive control is you have actual voting rights on the board. The court said nothing doing. We don't care about whether it's positive control or negative control. I apologize for the sound. It's all. It's about whether you had control or not, and whether you exercise control of a company that has become an NPA. It also, the question then came to who should have actually looked into the ineligibility, and how does COC allow for such plans to eventually pass through to the NCLT. And then it was decided the burden of proof is on the RP to make a prima facie decision as to the eligibility of the plan in terms of 29A, and pass that prima facie finding to the COC, and then COC will look into the nitty-gritties of who's related to what and the eligibility for 29A. After this, the Supreme Court said that, well, look, we are in no state, we can't let Essar Steel, a giant asset, to go and not bid it for. So if both New Metal and ArcelorMittal are such that they both are disqualified, they're given a certain amount of time. And I think this decision came in October 2018, and they were given time until November 15, 2018 to remove their disqualifications. And then the NCLT Ahmedabad was asked to consider their plans again. What actually happened was, after this time, ArcelorMittal went ahead and removed, standardized these accounts. As in, went and paid some money to KS Petron, paid some money to Uttam Galva, and their accounts changed from NPA to regular accounts. Does not mean that all their debts were cleared. They became regular accounts and not non-performing assets. I'll give you like a anecdote in this. I was filing applications in the DRT against Uttam Galva, but those got withdrawn because Uttam Galva's account became standardized by ArcelorMittal. So I had to pull out that litigation. Any case, moving on. Eventually, Arcelor was able to clear its disqualifications. New Metal wasn't. Arcelor's plan went through. Essar then, when Arcelor's plan was being considered at the 11th hour, Essar Steel Asia Holdings, again backed by Revan Soya, came back and they said, we'll offer a settlement plan at the 11th hour. But the settlement plan there was also being backed by somebody who was a promoter who would have ideally been banned in terms of 29A. By that time, that decision of Gujarat NRE Coke NCLAT had come, which said that settlement plans under the code, even if they're not given through the official route of the IBC, they also are governed by 29A principles. So just because a promoter is banned from giving a resolution plan doesn't mean a promoter or promoter-backed entity doesn't mean they can turn up and offer a settlement plan and take back the company which they were not allowed to take back in any case. Then this litigation went to NCLAT. NCLAT upheld NCLT's decision, and this eventually did the second round of Supreme Court, say in November 2019, which became the final Essar Steel judgment. I'll get into that at a later stage because that Essar Steel judgment had different connotations. I'll now move to what the purpose of interpretation of 29A, the two cases that I was a part of, and how the 29A flew into those cases. Yeah. Somebody's asked me, if promoter will not propose a settlement plan, then who will? Anybody else who seeks to acquire a resolution plan, who seeks to acquire the company and may not have had the wherewithal to go through the procedure of the court, but at a later date may feel, okay, I have the money, I'll buy it, and I don't want to go through the rigor of the resolution plan, and may want to withdraw the company from IBC completely. There are drawbacks to giving a settlement plan. Once you give a settlement plan, that means the company petition is set aside. And while you've settled the debts of a company, your corporate debtor is no longer immune to insolvency. Insolvency can happen. But a resolution, if you go on the resolution plan, the chances of it undergoing insolvency are far and few between. But the code is a rigorous mechanism. And the stipulations under the code in terms of 29A not only prevent the promoter but a large number of people from it disqualifies a lot of people. In fact, in Essar Steel, it was also discussed as to perhaps the 29A is too wide to not just cover promoters, but anybody else who may be related to a company. And it tried to narrow the reading down, but somebody who may be interested in acquiring a company and may not want to go through the procedures of court may give a settlement plan. There are a lot of people who've given a settlement plan. I understand the question. Your question is if a promoter is also barred from settlement plan, then what's the point? Why will anybody want to acquire? But I'm here to tell you that people wish to acquire companies even through settlement plans who are not promoters, but who don't want to go through the rigors of the code. That's your answer. This also, by the way, the 29A stipulation is not applicable in the case of MSMEs. In the case of MSMEs, the 29A bar will not apply, and promoters can go back and bid for these companies. Right? Okay. The next is the purpose of interpretation of 29A. Now, I was doing this case for actually with my team on this matter of SUCAM Industries. SUCAM Industries, SUCAM Power Systems, by the way, is a company that used to manufacture the inverter. Went into CII process. One of its directors wanted to bid for the plan. Director had also given guarantees in respect of that particular entity, as in respect of SUCAM's loans, and the guarantee had been given not just to one bank, to many banks. It had been given to, say, SBI or to other companies. What happened was, when the company went to CII process, all these banks before that tried to enforce the guarantee against. So what happens is, if I've given a loan to a company and it's not paying back, my first step before trying to plonk onto the CII process train is to go and ask the guarantor to give me the money back. So if I get repaid in full, then I don't need to go against the company. So all of these banks had issued notices to the guarantor director asking to pay back the money that was owed to these companies for the corporate debtor. He did not give the money back. Out of all these banks, one of the banks that did not go and issue a notice to the corporate debtor was SBI. Barring that, all other banks did, and the director was not able to pay these banks back. The one bank that didn't go was SBI, and SBI had initiated CII process against SUCAM. So the stipulation under 29AG, I think I should read it out because I think I missed it out while typing it. Yeah. So 29AH has been any person who has executed a guarantee in favor of a creditor in respect of a corporate debtor against which an application for CII process has been made by such creditor has been admitted under this code, and such guarantee has been invoked by the creditor and remains unpaid in full or in part. So the facts of this case were that the director had issued a lot of corporate guarantees, and these guarantees were invoked by all banks except SBI, the initiator bank. So while appearing for the RP, we said that listen, even if he has issued guarantees towards SBI and other banks, and even though SBI, the initiator bank, has not enforced the guarantee, other banks have enforced the guarantee. Enforcing guarantee means you go and make a notice to the guarantor saying, hey, please pay me back because the corporate debtor is not paying me back. So if the guarantor is, while the initiating bank had not enforced the guarantee and other banks had, you can't use this technicality to say that 29A doesn't apply to you. The other side, the director said that the words of 29, the wording in 29AH is fairly clear. If a guarantee has been executed in favor of a creditor in respect of a corporate debtor against which a CII process has been made, CII process application has been made by such creditor. That means if had he given an enforceable guarantee to the initiating bank and failed to fulfill his obligations under that guarantee, then this bar would apply to him. But since he's given guarantees to other banks, even if it's for the same corporate debtor, they should not apply. NCLT said nothing doing. The fact that you're not able to fulfill your guarantee obligations to other banks and not just the initiator bank means that you're not able to fulfill guarantee obligations. If you're not able to fulfill your guarantee obligations, there's no way in hell will you be able to take charge of a corporate debtor. Also, he was a director in the corporate debtor, which we argued that one, he's a related party and in control, and the whole purpose of 29A is to ensure that the company doesn't go back to somebody like him who's run down the company. That was our argument. Anyway, the court did a purposive interpretation of 29AH and said that yes, that's what the provision meant. Guarantees issued by not just the initiating bank but by the other banks, if they have remained unpaid, such person who was supposed to pay for them will no longer be eligible to file a resolution plan under 29A in terms of 29A. Another fun case was Electrosteel Steels Limited. Electrosteel Steels Limited was a corporate debtor in the Big 12 steel manufacturer. When there were two companies that bid for it eventually, one was Vedanta and another was Tata. The problem with Vedanta is an Indian subsidiary of Vedanta Resources PLC. Vedanta Resources PLC has international presence, including presence in Zambia. Now, in Zambia, once the corporate debtor therein, that is Vedanta Resources therein, had violated certain provisions of the Environment Protection Act of Zambia, and the in charge of the company had been given punishment, which under the Zambian Pollution Act, which exceeded more than 2 years of imprisonment. Now, Vedanta argued that so Tata and the RP said that while the parent company that were indicted was under the Zambian Pollution Act, the fact is that under 29A, anybody who's been made culpable of any offense which has imprisonment more than 2 years, that is sufficient of a disqualification under 29A. Vedanta, I should just read the provision out to you. It's 29AD so that it becomes clearer. A person shall not be eligible to be a resolution applicant if has been convicted for any offense punishable with imprisonment, 1 for 2 years or more under any act specified under the 12th schedule, or for 7 years or more under any law for the time being in force. So I think he fell under D2. I don't think the imprisonment wasn't 2 years, it was more than 7 years. So Vedanta tried to argue that this disqualification of imprisonment, offense punishable with imprisonment for more than 2 years or 7 years, is applicable to a natural person and not a juristic person, because companies can't be put in the imprisonment. So even if Vedanta Resources PLC, the parent company, was punished with an offense which is punishable with imprisonment of more than 7 years, Vedanta India should not be met with a disqualification, because Vedanta PLC nor Vedanta India could have been punished with an imprisonment of 7 years. Had that been a fine situation, the bar would probably apply. This is what Vedanta's argument was. NCLAT agreed, and now 29AD, the disqualification only applies to persons. I mean, if you have been imprisoned for 2 years or 7 years, depending on the law, you will be barred from making an application. It doesn't apply to a company. Right. Moving on, suppose now we cross that bar of having met the 29A application. Now we are at the stage where resolution plans are supposed to be filed with COC for their determination. The one case that was like the beginning of the end, frankly, in terms of filing by time, is the Liberty House case. The corporate debtor in question was Bhushan Steel and Bhushan Power and Steel, and everybody was bidding for it, and the time for bidding had gotten closed. Tata Steel bid, JSW bid, but Liberty House, which wanted to bid, missed the deadline and submitted resolution plans many days later. COC refused to entertain the resolution plan because it came late. RP also, I had the opportunity of appearing along with my team for the RP, and the RP also said that there's the whole point of the code is timely speedy resolution of the corporate debtor. If you allow for timelines to be this liquid, anybody would want to file a resolution plan at any point in time, and the COC and the RP would be forced to consider it. Then it went to the NCLT, and NCLT said a couple of things. It said while speedy resolution is one part of the object of the code, the other part is time is the procuring the maximum value for a corporate debtor. And Liberty was offering, in terms of the news, a large part of money. It was really sad that these news reports got leaked, and people say that it possibly informed everybody else's ideas of what Liberty House was offering. In any case, Liberty House was saying that it is only in the benefit of our corporate debtor that it receives more than one offer for a bid in a resolution plan, and technical requirements should not prevent a person from applying even at the last minute. Then what happened was that NCLT seemed to agree that time value of money, while timeliness of the code is one aspect, one pillar of the code, the other pillar of the code is maximization of value of the assets of the corporate debtor, and Liberty was allowed to bid. Interestingly, when finally it put forth the resolution plan was being considered, Liberty at the 11th hour pulled out, saying it doesn't have the requisite funds. So that happened. But as of that day, the decision was that timeliness versus money versus more money being offered. More money being offered will be considered as opposed to the time restrictions in the code. This made the ultimate test in Ultratech versus Binani. What happened was there's this company called Rajputana Properties Private Limited. They had bid for Binani Cement Limited, a cement company, manufacturing company based out of Kolkata. And this company called Rajputana was backed by another company called Dalmia Bharat, Dalmia Cement basically. And they want to acquire Binani. They put in the bid got shut, and then Ultratech submitted its bid. Now, then finally when it came to NCLT and NCLAT, two questions were for decision before the court. Ultratech was saying, okay, we came late, but we're ostensibly offering 1,000 crores more than Dalmia. Dalmia said that that's all right, but there was a time limit kept in the code. The code has processes to ensure timely resolution of the assets of the corporate debtor. And if those timelines aren't met properly, and if you allow anybody to enter at any time, what's the point? Ultratech also said, and this was a master stroke, it said that it's paying all sorts of creditors of the corporate debtor equally, as in it was paying the financial creditors and the operational creditors almost equally, and that's why its plan is ultimately better for Binani Cement. Rajputana tried to argue that the COC had approved its resolution plan, and even if there was a differential in payment in terms of the financial creditors and operational creditors, that was the ultimate decision of the COC. And COC's commercial wisdom cannot be replaced by judicial intervention. Also, the court, Rajputana also argued that the code itself creates classes between operational creditors, financial creditors, and you can treat unequals unequally and equals equally, and that's why it was paying differential amounts for different classes of creditors. Went to NCLAT had nothing doing. So basically, the answer to the question of timely application of resolution plans to the code has the answer to that is doesn't matter as long as somebody's offering more value. It seems like that objective is more important than meeting the timely resolution objective. That is meeting greater value for the assets of the corporate debtor. Also, Binani created then an entire conundrum as to does that mean that the code mandates equal payment to all creditors, or does it mean, or was it only in this case? In any case, this case went up to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court dismissed Rajputana's appeal and upheld the NCLAT decision. So for a while, it created a problem. It seemed like COC's commercial wisdom could be replaced by judicial intervention. Somehow, if COC had approved of a plan where differential payments were going to be made, while in this case COC wanted more money, if there were certain cases of COC was okay with certain kind of payment, maybe NCLAT or NCLT could interfere and perhaps change the plan, even if the Committee of Creditors didn't want so. In the middle of this, and the next litigation, which I'm going to talk about, which is Essar Steel, two important decisions came out. One was Swiss Ribbons. I think I asked everybody to have a look at Swiss Ribbons once. Swiss Ribbons, amongst saying the plethora of things that it did, ultimately in paragraph 46 says similar treatment needs to be given to OCs and FCs. And by saying similar and not the same, it gave playing value to a lot of resolution applicants or Committee of Creditors to decide, okay, we have to treat them equitably, but perhaps not equally. Then came another Supreme Court decision, a really well-written decision by Justice Khanvilkar called K. Shashidhar, in which he said COC has the primacy on decision-making in terms of the plan, the elements and constituents of a resolution plan. No court can do judicial intervention except for those particular parameters, such as it meets the resolution plan, meets the requirements of the law, is not outrightly discriminatory, and is fair and equitable. Aside from those elements, NCLTs can't replace commercial wisdom of COC with judicial wisdom. The final word came with when Essar Steel went to round 2. By that time, by the way, the code had also been amended to introduce certain changes in the code. One, a notional liquidation value had to be paid to the operational creditors, and they had to be paid before any payment was to be made to the FCs. Now, and another question was, and the COC was required, the code was amended to include words that the COC is required to assess the feasibility and viability of the resolution plan, and NCLT's role is to ensure that the resolution plan is fair and equitable. Now, none of these words had been explained really well in the code. So, while the amendments to the code were challenged, Essar Steel also came up. So, the Supreme Court bench heard both of these decisions together. It upheld Shashidhar and said the primacy of the commercial wisdom in relation to resolution plan is of the COC. COC's job is to assess the feasibility and viability in terms of commercials of a resolution plan. It will also decide the manner of distribution in resolution of the proceeds under resolution plan. An interesting fact is, in the Essar Steel, COC had formed a subcommittee in which they had included some people and not included some people. Some banks that got excluded was Standard Chartered, and they said since it has the highest security and because it doesn't have the highest security, and the secured creditors formed the subcommittee. The question was, does security matter in the code? As in, just because you are a secured creditor, should you be treated differently and get more payouts under the resolution plan? Because that's the case under liquidation, right? Under liquidation, secured creditors have the highest pedestal, and they get paid before anybody else gets paid. So the Supreme Court said that COC can determine the value, can determine the matter of payment, and security has to be given just the right amount of accordance in the code. As in, it's been said that you may take into account the COC may take into account the security given by creditors while determining the payments to them under a resolution plan, which means security can or cannot play a role while payments. But that's about it. A lot of noise happened before Essar Steel happened because a lot of banks were like, if security has no role, why should we give large loans? Banks dole out large loans because somebody else offers them property in relation to the loan being given. And if property will have no meaning, we will not give out large loans. We will not even take security. So the Supreme Court had to strike a balance saying, but security matters and security can be a consideration while giving out payments under a resolution plan, and for COC to evaluate a resolution plan, that can't be the ultimate factor. And whatever the decision is, COC has primacy, and NCLT or NCLAT can't interfere. So they said NCLAT and NCLT's jurisdiction is only circumscribed to inquiring into whether the merits of the resolution plan are such that they're equitable and they are fair, and they have been given, and that the creditors were given the minimum as promised to them under the code. So, so there are three things that the court will have to look into: whether this will ensure that the corporate debtor will run, whether the plan is such that it will ensure that the corporate debtor keeps on running as a going concern, whether the value of the assets of the corporate debtor are actually being maximized, and whether interests of all stakeholders, including operational creditors, are taken care of. If these parameters are adequately considered, then NCLT has to, as an NCLT has all the reasons to pass a resolution plan. If it doesn't, then you can go before NCLAT and show these parameters, saying Essar Steel held this. These three parameters were supposed to be looked into by the NCLT. These three parameters are met as per us, and that's why NCLT should have approved the resolution plan. As I said, so, and NCLT, by the way, said this. By the way, Supreme Court also upheld what Rajputana had argued back then, that unequal payments to creditors placed unequally in the scheme of CIR process is all right. Differential payment to differential class of creditors together with negotiating with the prospective resolution applicant for better or different terms is permitted. So in that scheme, what is the final answer? If somebody comes in late with more money, as in a late bid offering more money, they will be considered. But if COC approves somebody who is offering decent money and has come in time and has finally decided that the merits of the financials of such a plan are worthy of being considered for the resolution process of the corporate debtor, it can do so, and NCLT cannot intervene. That's the final answer to the problems that were raised in the Liberty, Binani, and Essar Steel. Now the code is amply clear, so I don't think there should be a problem in the future, but a large part of IBC litigation was occupied by this problem. Also, on a final note, I think I recall telling you right now that Liberty House, after all this hullabaloo, did not actually backed out of CIR process of Bhushan Power and Steel because it said it had no money. It also did so in respect of other corporate debtors such as ABG Shipyard. Then the regulator and NCLT became concerned, because you can't do that. You can't, after leading the litigation to a hilt, say, I had the money, and then suddenly say, I have no money to go through with the CIR process. So the regulator included this form called Form H, which the resolution applicant and the RP has to file while filing an application for approval of a resolution plan for the NCLT. And a necessary implication of Form H is that the resolution applicant has to give a performance guarantee. As in, say, I am executing this bank guarantee in your favor. Should I not be able to perform what I said under the resolution plan, please go and invoke the guarantee, and the money will be taken from my account and given to you, because I promised to perform the obligations on the resolution plan, and I did not do so. Also, if you contravene a resolution plan, by the way, whether the corporate debtor or somebody else, is penalty under the code under section 74, which is an offense for violating any provisions of the resolution plan. So those are the litigations that can surround the last stage of a resolution plan. If it happens, if resolution plan doesn't get approved and it goes under liquidation, and liquidation process starts again, and it in some broadly mirrors the CIR process with the same sort of problems. All right, I think that's about it. If somebody else has questions, I'll take them, and if no questions, I'll sign off. Yeah, awesome. Could you please repeat as to where the provision of performance guarantee was provided? It's Form H in the CIR process regulations. Let me actually open that for you. Yeah, something called the compliance certificate. It comes from regulation 39.4 of the CIR process regulation. So this is where the provision of the bank guarantee comes from. This is an amendment made somewhere in mid 2018, which made this amendment to the CIR process regulation, regulation 39.4. Any other question? Could you please explain Form H? Form H is like a compliance certificate. Now, while the RP files a resolution plan, so as you know, after COC clears a plan, it has to be given to the NCLT for final approval. This application is made by the RP. RP, while giving this application will also ask the resolution applicant to give a compliance certificate in Form H. I'll tell you what it reads like. Name, it has to have all these particulars: name of the CD, date of initiation, date of constitution, final list, date of submission of resolution plan, date of expiry of 180 days, fair value or liquidation value of the corporate debtor, what you're giving in terms of that I don't need, that I'm eligible in terms of 29A, all that. So it's like a compliance certificate that you fill, that a resolution applicant says, I am eligible in terms of all provisions of the code, and I will give a bank guarantee along with this Form H to prove that I am willing to take over the obligations of the code. Anything else? Is that it, Tilak? Tilak, is that it? So we can end this. Okay, I think this is about it. I don't see any other questions. Text me, preferably text me, don't email me. I'm sorry, I don't get time to check my email, if they're my personal email. Do text me if you're require me to answer some questions. I hope this session generally.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for the session.
All right, awesome.
Definitely very helpful for us. We are very thankful to you for taking out time and enabling us to learn the practical aspects. It was a very informative course. I thank you again for putting a great effort in preparation and the actual sessions. I thank you on behalf of the alumni cell, and we hope to host you again. Thank you so much, ma'am.
All right, thank you so much. I'll send across this PPT, all right, to you. Okay, awesome. Thank you.